Well, hello and welcome to In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, a series of interviews focused on Hong Kong, produced by Hong Kong Watch. And in previous weeks, we've had some very distinguished guests, Martin Lee, Lord Alton, the former South Korean Human Rights Ambassador Jung-Hoon Lee. This week, I'm really delighted to welcome another very distinguished guest and a friend of mine, Miriam Lexmann, who was elected to the European Parliament last year, is from Slovakia and has become a champion for human rights and democracy in Hong Kong, even in just the short space of time that she's been in the European Parliament. So Miriam, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the invitation.
Miriam, let me start. We're meeting more or less a week after the 23rd anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, but also the imposition of the new national security law in Hong Kong, which most people would agree destroys the principle of one country, two systems, Hong Kong's autonomy, Hong Kong's basic freedoms. What are your reflections from what you've seen and what you know of it on what this means for Hong Kong, but also for the world?
Well, I must say that as I come from an ex-communist country, from Slovakia, I'm probably the kind of belief that China as a totalitarian regime is going to stick to the agreement was maybe a little bit naive. On the other hand, I think that the West had responsibility to see if the treaty was implemented in the course of the 23 years, and maybe we have failed to make sure that this treaty that China will be keeping its word and will adhere to the treaties which are locked by the UN, and the international community is sort of co-responsible for the treaty and for keeping the word and having keeping up the system as agreed, which was one country, two political systems.
Absolutely. Do you think actually that if Britain and other democratic countries had heeded the warning signs earlier, I mean, I've been warning of the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms for the past 5 or 6 years. Do you think if governments had acted earlier, we might not be where we are today? Or do you think it really was inevitable because the regime is not one that can be trusted?
It's hard to say. I mean, I believe that the Iron Curtain has failed because the world that time was a little bit different, that there was no trade interaction between the free world and the communist regime. After the fall of end of the Cold War and fall of the Berlin Wall, we probably saw that there is possible something like a global world which will be interconnected by trade, but the different regimes will not directly influence or will not have a direct influence on each other. I think we have failed to see soon enough that this does not work. And I will bring some examples. I think the first failure was with Russia, that the EU mainly, or the kind of free part of Europe was engaging with Russia because we believe that we can change Russia, we can make Russia a democratic free state by increasing the living conditions, by trade, by bringing the idea of freedom into the society through trade. I think we have realized in a certain point this doesn't work, but we were unable to pay the price and maybe make some concessions in our engagement with Russia because of the economic profits we had from such a kind of arrangements. And I believe I used to work for the International Republican Institute. It's a international organization which is focusing on fighting for freedom and democracy worldwide. And I believe a moment when we saw that not only Russia is becoming a danger or challenge for the West because of its interference into our society, its ability to practically disinform our own citizens. But China is becoming a big challenge too. And I remember many discussions where people were telling me like, yes, but Russia is an ideological power, but China is not. China seeks only more trade and trade opportunities, and it's only, I mean, its all engagement is based on the desire to have trade benefits. Unfortunately, coming from an ex-communist country, of course, I couldn't believe that someone believes that the communist regime, as China, is not ideological and does not seek to influence its international partners, not maybe because they want to impose the same regime in those countries, but because they want to influence those countries, that they are more behaving more according to their will and according to their desire. And unfortunately, now we see that this is happening.
Just briefly taking a step back to your own experiences of growing up under a communist regime, what does that lead you to anticipate in terms of what will happen to Hong Kongers now in Hong Kong, now that they are much more directly under the rule of a communist regime?
I have to say that practically, yes, my past is something which gives me energy and gives me the desire to help other countries to become free. I feel it very strongly that because during the Cold War, there were people from the other side of the Berlin Wall were trying and risking to try to defeat the communist regime, try to help and set us free. I think that it's our duty in a way, I mean, us who were helped to set our countries free, to help other countries to become free and to help them and support their fight for freedom. In the global world as we have it now, it's more easy in a way because it's easier to get in touch with people in the other parts of the world, but also makes it more difficult because the Western world, the democratic world, through the trade engagement, as I mentioned before, became in a way complicit with some of the regimes to a certain extent.
You were elected to the European Parliament just only last year and took your seat late last year. And yet in such a short space of time, you've specifically taken up the issue of Hong Kong. You've become one of the most prominent voices in Hong Kong in the European Parliament. What can you say a bit about how you got involved with Hong Kong?
Thanks to the invitation of you, Ben, I had been personally to Hong Kong in November last year to observe the district elections. So this experience, because before working for an organization supporting democracy and freedom, I was mainly involved in the regions I knew best, which is the former Soviet countries and the Western Balkans, practically the kind of larger Europe. And when I was in Hong Kong, it was a really, really very powerful experience for me because first of all, I learned that the communist regime can encroach in a very, very cunning way, that it can actually enslave people who are free, rich, and kind of enjoy the freedom of the world. Because before I had the impression that the regime can kind of enslave people only because there are economic problems, there is poverty, or at the beginning of the 20th century, practically the Marxist regime was based on the assumption that they are going to help the poor working class. But there in Hong Kong, I saw that the regime became far too more sophisticated and is able to enslave people also in such a free city as Hong Kong. So that was for me, first of all, a kind of lesson learned, but secondly, when I then became a member of the European Parliament, it helped me to understand that we really, as the West, we really have to be more careful with China, because this is not only putting in danger the people in Hong Kong, and obviously I feel responsible also for their freedom, because in the global world, I really feel that we are co-responsible for freedom in the entire world. But also, I kind of realized how big challenge and how dangerous China can be for us in the West and for our own freedom.
You mentioned your visit to Hong Kong to observe the elections, and of course the result of the elections was an overwhelming expression of a desire for democracy by the people of Hong Kong. What were your feelings, both observing polling day and then seeing the results as they came?
I was astonished by the boldness of the people, because all this was practically after the umbrella movement and then the kind of 1 million march, where we see that, which was followed by detentions, by crackdown on the civil society and on many of the freedom fighters or the leaders of the democratic opposition. And I really saw that those people who went to the polls and voted for the pro-democracy leaders were taking a high risk, although it didn't see like this. But because they were able to kind of to guarantee the threshold that so many people were bold enough to approach and cast their votes for democracy, let's say, for freedom, the election was a landslide victory. And on that moment, I was actually thinking how the West can help to support this. And I think because of the next half year, we were not bold enough. We didn't come with clear strategy. Unfortunately, now we see that any hope for one country, two system, or rule of law and autonomy of Hong Kong is fading.
Since you entered the European Parliament, you've undertaken a lot of initiatives for Hong Kong already. You mobilized over 30 MEPs to sign on to a statement when the 15 pro-democracy leaders were arrested on the 18th of April. And I remember speaking to you the day after they'd been arrested, and you said, let's organize a statement. And then you secured, together with your colleagues, the resolution in the European Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. What's your assessment of the mood in Europe and in the institutions of the EU about the situation in Hong Kong and about the Chinese Communist Party's behavior?
I have to admit that I think that it looks like the pandemic has been a wake-up call for the EU. And that was maybe the only reason why we could gather 30 signatures within a couple of hours to defend the 15 dissidents being detained in Hong Kong, or then thanks to Hong Kong Watch, we were helping to get and all together we managed over 900 signatures later on to protest against the unilateral decision to impose the security law in Hong Kong. I think this would be not possible if we did not learn the lesson how dangerous China is during the pandemics, when we realized that China is directly influencing and disinforming our citizens. There was a big scandal in the EU where practically China has influenced a report on disinformation, which was called EU versus Disinfo, where the EU was kind of gathering information how China is influencing the different citizens. We have a case where the ambassador of the EU to China was censoring a letter drafted by the ambassadors of EU member states to the people of China. We have a leak of information that the diplomats who are negotiating with China the new investment deal do not have the human rights and Hong Kong issues related to Hong Kong in their minutes to follow during the negotiations. All this has helped to kind of wake up at least part of the policy makers and leaders inside of the European Union that China is a big danger. The problem is that we are very slow in our reactions, because I think we need to really, really talk about sanctions tomorrow, and it's already too late. And I really welcome the step of the UK that they announced the implementation of the Magnitsky Act. The European Union has its own version, the Global Sanction Act, but this is not ready yet. And this makes us much weaker against the regime, because the regime is really imposing its own rules over our own society and our own businesses, I have to say, and we don't have any ways how to protect our own interests and interests of the people in Hong Kong or Taiwan or other people worldwide.
Yes, it's interesting. The resolution that the European Parliament put forward was, in my view, exactly the right mix of punitive measures, diplomatic measures, and a relief package. But as you've just been describing, the European Parliament has spoken very clearly. The United States Congress and government have acted quite decisively. The British government has acted fairly decisively, although there's more that I would like them to do. But what we've heard from the leaders of the EU institutions besides the Parliament, particularly from Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell, has been some fine rhetoric, but no actual indication of what the EU is going to do. And you've just outlined that. I mean, for the EU to talk about standing up for our values, which Ursula von der Leyen did, but not actually say how they're going to stand up for our values, is a problem.
Yes, exactly. I mean, here I would only say that we really have to, I mean, we have said nice words, I mean, and the report has these 9 words and has kind of plan, but then words have to be followed by deeds as soon as possible, because otherwise it will only remain nice declarations. And I think what is absolutely vital here is that the European Union has to realize that our values are not our weakness, but our strength. That if we adhere to our values, that will make EU much stronger player on a global level than if we are always trying to find compromises and maybe or prioritizing small victories or economic gains before statements or positions which are principled and maybe sometimes even costly.
You've just recently formed or begun to form a parliamentary group, the Friends of Hong Kong in the European Parliament, which brings together a really bipartisan group of people across the different political groupings. What will the group that you've helped to form do in practice, and what message do you think it sends to the world that, for example, a Slovak conservative, yourself, has joined together with a German Green, a Lithuanian centrist, a Spanish socialist, and a former Polish foreign minister? That's quite a broad collection.
Yeah, we thought that what is absolutely vital in order to be able to support the deeds after the kind of declarative words is that we need to gain a cross-party support, that we need to bring people together who are maybe having different ideological backgrounds or see certain positions differently. But if we unite and will seek seek together the solutions for Hong Kong and for withstanding our own freedom, as I said, because our own freedom is now endangered by the aggression of China, that we will give our work a more legitimacy, and also will be able to bring more people on board as if it was only one party action. I have to stress here that most of the names, as you mentioned, are people who come from ex-communist countries. And I think this is a maybe important point, that people who do understand the regime, they do understand how the regime undermines freedom and how Orwellian behavior can change society from one day to another without maybe realizing, because it kind of uses its own maybe adjusted ways how to undermine freedom of people and how to impose fear, which inevitably leads to loss of freedom. We understand this maybe better because we grew up in a society which was held by a totalitarian regime, and then we saw how our countries changed from a communist regime into a free democratic state. So I think this is a very important as well, that these people are there, because we can help the others maybe to see where the dangers in a communist regime like in China, the Communist Party's approach lies.
My penultimate question and my last question on relating to EU policy. Germany will take over the presidency of the EU Council, the Council of Ministers later this year. What specific action would you like Germany as the new president to take? And in particular, what are your views of the discussion about the investment deal between the EU and China?
I really hope that Germany will be bold enough to make or help us to make a U-turn in our approach to China. And of course, I understand that it's impossible to kind of now to build up the Cold War or the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain between the EU and China. But on the other hand, we have to be very careful how we reset the relationships. And I understand that Germany has big investment projects in China, that the business is running often the kind of way how we engage with China. And I think here it's really the question, if we are going to be able to draw a line and build a new relationship with China, where China will have to behave and keep its words. And especially now, when the Sino-British Treaty was breached by China, we have absolutely no reason to trust China that they are going to keep the word in other international treaties. In the new investment deal or the new trade agreement EU is going to set up with China. So from this perspective, I believe that I hope that Germany will be, as I said, bold enough to and will be able to take the leadership because of their economic interests, not despite, that we will draw a new line, because a just economic relations is always, or is the only way how it can be a flourishing deal. Otherwise, there will be costs which might not seem to be, might be not financial, but might be different, which we don't see now, but they will definitely follow.
Thank you. My last question is a straightforward, but maybe also a challenging question. We're now in an era in Hong Kong where Hong Kong people will probably respond in one of three or four ways. There are some who very courageously say they're going to continue to fight and potentially risk going to prison, maybe for as long as a life sentence. There are others who may try to continue the movement, but in more subtle, indirect, creative ways because of the risks involved. There are those who for very understandable reasons, will think that it's too high a price and will withdraw from activism completely. And then there are those who will leave the city. To all of them, whatever choices people make in Hong Kong, what message would you have for them at this time?
I have two messages. The first one, I would use a quote of a political prisoner, a person who has been in prison for 9 years in Slovakia. who was an opponent to the communist regime. And before he was sentenced to practically a life sentence, then it was shortened to 9 years, he said at a trial that to the communist regime, he said, "You hold the power in your hands, but we hold the truth. We don't envy you the power and do not long for it. We are satisfied with the truth, because truth is bigger and stronger than power." And this is my message to all those who you mentioned. I'm not going to judge on anyone, because I understand that everyone in Hong Kong who desires to live in a free city will have to find the way how they can react to the new situation. Some people are bolder than others, but maybe some people can have a different way how they will influence and fight and struggle for the freedom of their city. So I think this message is to everyone. If they have the truth, and the truth is that people are born to be free, I think this is the kind of guiding aspiration which can maybe help them to survive in the very difficult times they are going to face. And my second message is that, as I mentioned, before or during the Cold War, the world was not global, was not very interconnected. There was not so much interaction between the regime, the communist regime, and the free world. Today, we live in a global world, and that makes us, living in a free world, responsible for the freedom of the people in Hong Kong. And if they're going to suffer, if they're going to oppress, is oppression and suffering which we will feel as our own. And that's why we have a duty to do our best to defend the people of Hong Kong and their desire to live in a free city.
That's a wonderful note to end on. It reminds me of the many years I spent working for the working with the democracy movement and for freedom for Burma or Myanmar. And Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was under house arrest, said her very famous words, "Please use your liberty to promote ours." And I guess that's really what you and I are saying in this conversation, that even if people in the city of Hong Kong will find it more difficult to promote their freedom, or will at least face a very, very big price for doing so, you and I who do enjoy freedom now can use our freedom to promote Hong Kong's freedoms.
Exactly. We have to do our best.
Absolutely. And when you visited Hong Kong last year, of course, I was unable to go with you because I had been denied entry to Hong Kong in 2017. Now the national security law, one of its components is an extraterritorial component, so that theoretically, because it says that non-Hong Kongers outside Hong Kong can be in breach of the law as well. Theoretically, what this conversation we're having between London and Slovakia is breaking the national security law in Hong Kong. But I hope the day will come when Hong Kong will be free, and maybe you and I can go and visit Hong Kong together.
I hope so too, Ben.
Thank you very much.
All the best for it.
Thank you, Miriam. Thanks for joining us.
All the best. Thank you.